Hello friends, today I wanted to talk about one challenging symptom of complex PTSD, and that's brain fog. Anyone that has undergone childhood trauma, whether it was because your parents were addicts or emotionally immature, or maybe they had a personality disorder like NPD or borderline personality disorder, you understand that term brain fog. It feels like you can't string two sentences together. And if you do put two sentences together, you spend a lot of time ruminating and wondering if they made sense. Your memory feels inconclusive, right? It's so hard to remember things. It feels impossible to make decisions. It's almost like you can see the possibilities or the choices, but your brain just feels stuck. It's super hard to feel present in your life because you don't even feel connected to yourself. So I want to talk about why that happens, but more importantly, I really want to talk about solutions. You guys know me by now, right? It's not enough to have the why. It's not enough to understand the suffering. We have to find ways to work through it so that we can get to the other side where we're not still suffering. And I know that a lot of people feel like once you have PTSD or complex PTSD that you have it forever. Well, I don't believe that. But I do believe that we have to do things to overcome it. Okay, we can't do nothing and just learn about what it is. We actually have to change different thoughts, different beliefs. We have to do a lot of rewiring of the brain, and we have to get balance back in our brain and our body. So we can overcome it, but it's not because time passes by and we just spring back to who we're supposed to be. We do have to do the work. Okay, and if you're willing to do that, make sure you watch to the end of the video because I'm going to give you practical tips and suggestions that are helpful. And I'd also like to invite you to my live workshop, which is going to be Saturday, the 31st of July at 1 Eastern, where we're actually going to talk about rebalancing after narcissistic abuse and how to get that balance back in the brain and body. So I'll leave the link here for anyone that's interested. Okay, so why does it happen? I know there was a time in my life where if somebody said, Michelle, because of toxic relationships, because of certain emotionally abusive relationships, you can have brain damage, I might have laughed. I might have looked at them in disbelief, but I wouldn't have necessarily believed it. We don't tend to quickly associate brain damage with toxic relationships, right? We understand that they cause emotional pain. We understand that they hurt you on an emotional level. But if there is no physical abuse going on where the person is not putting their hands on you, we don't tend to associate a person having physical damage because of the abuse. But that's exactly what happens if you are in a long-term relationship with somebody that is actively creating a tremendous amount of stress, activating your fight or flight, emotionally manipulating you to the point that it's not just affecting you emotionally, it affects you physically, it affects your brain, it affects your body, and it can cause brain damage in the sense that it changes the size of certain parts of your brain, and that creates imbalance. So just to kind of simplify it really quick, okay, if you are in a relationship with somebody that is constantly throwing you in your fight or flight, in other words, every day you're walking through an emotional minefield where you don't know what's going to provoke their anger. You don't know how to stop it. Nothing makes sense, right? So basically, it's like being at war in your own house. So your alarm system in your body or your limbic network is always turned on. Now, something I'm going to discuss in the workshop, the upcoming workshop, is the fact that we need that alarm system, right? The alarm system, our limbic network, is good. It helps us to stay safe. But we're not supposed to live in that alarm system 24/7. It's very much like your home alarm, right? You have an alarm on your house so that you protect your belongings. That alarm is supposed to blare horribly, right, to get your attention if there's danger. And we're grateful for the moments that it does that. But imagine trying to live a peaceful, calm life with your family in your home when that home alarm is blaring 24/7. And let me tell you, that sound is not a pleasant sound. Imagine it blaring 24/7. Eventually that's going to affect you physically. It's going to give you headaches. It's going to cause distress in your body. It's going to rob you of your peace and your happiness. It's going to be impossible to think clearly because all you hear is that sound. It's interrupting your ability to focus in a calm and productive way. Well, that's similar to what happens when your alarm system in your body is blaring 24/7. So our amygdala is what sounds the alarm. And when that alarm is on all the time, imagine the amygdala like a muscle. If you are utilizing one muscle over the other for a long period of time, obviously the one you're utilizing the most is going to get stronger, and the one that you're not utilizing is going to get weaker. In this case with the brain, the amygdala gets stronger in the sense that it actually increases in size. Because you are living a large part of your life with your amygdala in charge, so to speak, it gets larger. And the area of your life where you're supposed to be living the majority of your life, your prefrontal cortex, the areas there, like the hippocampus, wind up shrinking. Why? One, because you're not utilizing those areas of your brain. So they get weaker, just like a muscle, they shrink in size. On top of it, when you are in high stress, for example, the stress hormone cortisol deeply affects the hippocampus. In fact, studies have shown that high levels of cortisol can actually cause dementia. Okay, so that's how strong, that's how bad for you those high levels of cortisol are when it comes to that part of your brain. So imagine living your life every single day with cortisol pumping through your body. It's attacking the areas of your brain that help with executive functioning, with thinking clearly, decision making, short-term memory, learning. And the only thing that your brain is doing is sounding that alarm. So in that sense, that's why we say it causes brain damage, because it does change the size of certain parts of your brain, and as a result of that, it changes how well your brain operates. Okay, now the good thing is that just like it changed in a negative way, we'll call it negative neuroplasticity, thankfully science helps us to see that the brain can relearn. In videos in the past, I've likened what narcissistic abuse does to the brain with what happens when you have a stroke. Okay, it's not exactly the same, but just hear me out for a second. So when you have a stroke, right, certain neural pathways die, like the connection to that pathway dies. So let's say the pathway is being able to walk or being able to read. Let's say being able to read, okay? That pathway dies and people lose the ability to read. That doesn't mean that they lose it forever. But what it does mean is that they have to retrain their brain to find another neural pathway to get there. Sometimes they start with something simple, like the vowels, right? Learning at a 5-year-old level. They start learning and they make new connections to go around what died, right? But they create a new neural pathway to being able to read. Well, the same thing can happen if you have complex PTSD or brain damage after narcissistic abuse. There are certain things that you used to be able to do easily that now you're struggling with. And in this case, for the sake of this video, we're talking about thinking clearly, right? There might have been a time when your memory was amazing. There might have been a time when you had the ability to make decisions and stand by them, when you trusted your gut instinct. Unlike a stroke, it's not that those pathways no longer exist, okay? But what it is that those pathways have not been traveled down for so long that, think of a pathway, right, in a jungle or in the woods that nobody travels down for a long time. Eventually it gets overgrown and it's hard to locate, not because it's not there, but because it hasn't been maintained. So part of being able to heal complex PTSD and break out of that brain fog is going down those pathways that have become overgrown and that you haven't had access to in a long time. Now, you may have noticed in the title that I spelt fog with an extra G. And I did that on purpose, okay? Because part of brain fog and the neural pathways that were changed and the ones that we have to go down have to do with the acronym from that word of F.O.G.G. Okay, the first one is fear. If you lived where there was constant chronic stress, emotional manipulation, emotional abuse, especially covert, where you couldn't really understand what was going on, but you knew something was going on, right? You wound up always being in the emotion of fear. If you don't believe me, think about it. Think about the expression walking on eggshells. Were you always walking on eggshells in the sense that you never knew what was going to happen next? So instead of just living life authentically, you were always like wondering what was going to happen. Very much like somebody at war who's walking through terrain that they don't feel safe. Right? Though that's the same emotional state that you were in if you were living in an environment where there was a lot of emotional manipulation, psychological abuse. So because it was chronic, right, it's not necessarily about intensity. It may not have been a 10 on the intensity level where things were flying out of control. Things were being thrown, the threat of violence was there. No, you may not have been there. It may have been a low-grade chronic fear. It may have been fear of getting the person upset or angry because you didn't know what was going to happen. Sometimes with my clients, I'll ask them, I'll say, what were you afraid of? If there was no physical abuse, what do you think your fear was? And when they start looking at it, they're amazed to realize that there was no threat of physical violence. Now, obviously there are cases where there is, but I'm talking about covert emotional abuse, okay? So I'm not talking about the physical abuse in this case. So they say there was no threat of physical violence, but I felt responsible for their anger. And so I was always afraid of them not being happy, afraid of them criticizing me, afraid of them being upset. Regardless, okay, if the fear, that chronic fear was there all the time, you now have a neural pathway that has been traveled for the emotion of fear. And because it's been traveled for so long, it is now what we call a default emotion, right? You don't have to try to feel fear. It's just there all the time. Part of working through the F.O.G.G. is working through that fear that keeps it alive, because when we're in that state of fear, our amygdala is activated, our body is being flooded with cortisol, adrenaline, neuroepinephrine. So we have to be able to calm that fear. Now, I want to be honest, working through that piece of the F.O.G.G. is obviously logic. There's a logic component where you have to start recognizing, well, what is that fear? Why am I afraid? Is it realistic that I'm afraid? We have to get the cognitive portions into our conscious awareness so that we can overcome any cognitive distortions that were created during the abuse. But that's not always enough. And I'm going to share something in my life recently. I would say from about a year, this past year is when I really just, I'm me. I'm authentically me. And it feels amazing. And a lot of it has been, you guys who have followed my channel from the beginning, you guys watched me go from a shell of a person into who I am today. But this past year, what really, really helped was, you know, I was having some health issues and I was going to the doctors, probably the past 3 years, going to the doctor, and everything was always fine. Everything's fine, you're fine, you're fine. So finally, I went to a doctor that was more holistic, and a doctor that included kinesiology, which is muscle testing, where he's really looking at my body as an individual, right? And what he learned, what he helped me to see was, despite everything that I had already done on my healing journey, first, what I found so impressive was he knew that I had PTSD without me telling him. He's like, do you have PTSD? And sure enough, I told him a little bit about my life. And I asked him how he knew. And so he told me some of the ways that you can tell that a person's body is on, or their sympathetic nervous system is kicked on. And so what he helped me with, that I'm so grateful for, was he helped my adrenals. So I needed to get something to get my adrenals under control. He also told me that there was constant epinephrine in my body, which is a stress hormone. And so he helped me with that as well as diet. Now here's the interesting thing with the diet. He told me that I had a gluten allergy. Now, gluten allergies can affect a person in one of two ways. They either affect a person's gut or they affect a person's nervous system. So in my case, it didn't affect my gut. It was wreaking havoc on my nervous system, which meant no matter what I did logically and cognitively to overcome my PTSD, no matter what I did with my body somatically, right, I still needed help so that my body stopped producing hormones, stress hormones, that were affecting my nervous system. And I also needed to change my diet so that that didn't keep my nervous system overactivated. Those changes were amazing, okay? I never realized, it wasn't until after those hormones were under control that I could feel and realize that, wow, even when I thought I was relaxed, there was like this energetic buzz in me that I could still feel. Now, getting that under balance was huge in my taking another shift forward of really feeling regulated with my body. So with that, I want to encourage you. I want to encourage you to go to a holistic doctor that's going to look beneath the surface. That's not just going to look at the everyday things that may be going wrong. That's not just going to give you an anxiety pill, but someone that's really going to try to get to the root cause of what's going on in your body. I highly recommend that. Moving on to the O. The O stands for overwhelm. When you have been through narcissistic abuse, childhood trauma, your brain has been overloaded with things that don't make sense. Our brain likes to make sense of things, and when it can't, it gets stuck. And so because it was on overload, trying to make sense for so many years, it's still kind of at that level of overload of information. So when it comes to working through the overwhelm, helping your body to get grounded, doing grounding techniques that help you to be calm, but also starting to pay attention to your thoughts and bring them back to the present moment. You start training your mind to be in the moment. And in the moment, there's a whole lot less stress than when you're up there in the past or in the future, overthinking about what happened or what might happen. Okay, so we start training our brain. And again, that's like training or creating a new neural pathway. The neural pathway to ruminating and to overthinking is well worn if you've undergone childhood trauma or narcissistic abuse or both. So bringing your thoughts to the present moment takes time. You are carving a new pathway in your brain to help you to be present in the moment, okay? It takes time, but each time you notice the overwhelm and you bring yourself to the present moment, you're actually taking another machete out to that overgrown pathway and you're just clearing it once again. Guilt is next. Guilt is feeling bad for things that you did or didn't do. When you wake up, okay, when you wake up after narcissistic abuse or childhood trauma, you realize not only what the other person did, but you also start realizing what you did or did not do. For some people, they realize, why did I stay so long in something that was so painful? Why did I allow this? Why didn't I do that? And that guilt can consume you. And the thing with guilt, the thing with looking at those things that you could have or should have done, is that no matter how many times you run them through your mind, they don't produce a solution. And so you stay stuck. And there's your mind, it's stuck. Brain fog is all about feeling stuck. So part of working through it is getting to a place of forgiveness of yourself. Forgiving the things that you did wrong. Because guess what? We all did things wrong. There's not one person that can say, I did nothing wrong, it was all the other person. There are things that we did wrong, and one of them, for example, is tolerate abusive behavior. So at some point we have to forgive the past. We have to forgive ourselves for what we can't change, for not understanding then what we know now. Okay? If we don't, we can stay stuck in that brain fog. And the last thing is grief. And when it comes to narcissistic abuse, There is a lot of grief because there's a lot of loss. And so healing is about working through that emotion. Sometimes we just want to push it aside. Sometimes we want to stifle it because it's so overwhelming and we just want to live our life, right? The problem is that if we don't work through it, that grief follows you around. It keeps popping up in your life. It keeps you stuck, right? It keeps you feeling stuck because you're not able to be happy in the moment and creating the life that you want. So working through that fog is giving yourself the time to work through the grief. The way past is through, okay? And it's not fun to do. It's emotional. It's hard. It's challenging. But it's also the only way to process and release the emotions that keep you stuck. And if you have any challenges doing that on your own, you might want to check out the Thriver School of Transformation, because we meet live weekly on Zoom and we work through all the aspects of healing complex PTSD. We work through it together. So not only do you have that weekly support, but you also have a group of people that understand, that have been through it, that are going through it, and they're there to support you as well. So if you're struggling through that, make sure you check out the link to the Thriver School of Transformation. And again, I invite you to my live workshop on the 31st of July, where we're going to talk more in depth about what can be done to give you that balance after narcissistic abuse.